What's going on, average Joes and casual readers out there and everyone else? I am Joe, and welcome back to my channel for another video. Today, I want to talk about standalone books in the science fiction and fantasy genres. I noticed that a lot of people have their own lists going out, and I thought that I might as well take a stab at it myself to see what I have. And as I was going through my Goodreads list, scrolling through all the books that I've read in the last 3 or 4 years, I realized I do not read a lot of standalone books. Um, Sci-fi and fantasy tend to be more series because they generally the things you want out of sci-fi and fantasy that you're looking for is world building, character building, and character arcs, and those things. And typically, those things take time to develop, take time to go through, and the payoff is what's worth it. Usually, in these epic fantasies or just fantasies in general, whether even it's a trilogy or not. So standalones are kind of few and far in between. And also, if I ever need a standalone or palette cleanser, it's typically going to go to a murder mystery or thriller, which none of those are going to be on this list because this is just for sci-fi fantasy standalones. So I wanted to put that out there now. I'm going to go over my top seven, and it's almost like only seven, but it's just the top seven that I've read. And I also want to do this now. I thought about not doing it because I don't have that many standalones that I've read, but I think it'll be really good to do in the future to come back to this. And, and this makes me want to actively add more standalones in the sci fi fantasy genre, which could be a lot of fun, especially getting into some more self published authors and such, because they do a lot of those as well. Not knowing if they're ever going to do these big epic series or get picked up for those. So a lot of those are just standalone sci-fi and fantasy, which are great. So I'd like to revisit this in 6 months to a year to see if they've changed at all. But I wanted to get my list out there now for that. First note that I will say is that I know Sword of Kaigen is on most people's lists. It is not on mine. It is not in my top seven. And while that is great and has done a lot of really good things, it missed the mark for me on a few things. Still a really good read, very worth it. It's a 4 out of 5 read for me, but there were a few things that dragged along a little too far. I just want to throw that out there now because I know it's on pretty much everybody's list that does this because it was such a great standalone. And if somebody would mention in the comments, that's why. Also, if I were a betting man, I would say that it's not going to be a standalone long. There will probably be a continuation at some point, especially if the writer wants to get a little bit more political with the writing. Okay, so top seven, top seven. The first one, number seven, I'll go in. It's kind of in a loose order, but it's a little bit of a priority. Top seven. My seven. This also might get raised a few eyebrows because it's a Stephen King book, but it's not one of his more talked about popular books. And just keep in mind, remember, this is sci-fi fantasy. This isn't horror. This isn't thriller. That's what I just want to get all across now. That's the main ones that Stephen King writes, and some of his other sci-fi fantasy ones, or at least fantasy ones, are like Dark Tower. That's a series and such. So number seven, I'm going to say also because this was my introduction to Stephen King, and if you're looking to get into Stephen King and you like sci-fi fantasy, that's also why this is on this list, and that is Firestarter. Firestarter was a lot of fun to read. As I said, this is for my first Stephen King book that I've ever read. That's I dipped my toes into the Stephen King water, and Stranger Things is loosely inspired by Firestarter. So the writers of the show are big fans of, I believe, Stephen King and Firestarter. So there's a lot of things taken from that, and in a good way. So there's a young girl who can start fires with her mind, and people are after her, and chaos ensues. Basically, it is really good. The characters are really good as well. Obviously, it's probably a mix between fantasy and thriller. I don't know if you can call it fantasy just because somebody can control fire with their mind, but it's kind of a borderline. So it's a mix of both. That's why I wanted to put it on here. But it's a really cool, really good read, and it won't take you too long either. So if you were thinking about getting into Stephen King, or just that's something that interests you, a good palate cleanser. Number six. This one is going to be very different, and I kind of want to encourage more people to read it just because it'd be fun to talk about. And that is The First 15 Lives of Harry August. This book is not your typical fantasy or sci-fi. It's kind of a weird hybrid of, again, that and a thriller. The premise of this book is there are people that it's like one in a million. There's one person every million who think of Groundhog's Day, where you wake up and then it's repeat the same day over and over. But instead of Groundhog's Day, it's your entire life. So you repeat your same life over and over again. So you go through your life, you die, and you come back to life and you're born again, same day, same happening, same parents, and you go through and you just repeat your same life over and over until something happens. There's a way for you to die, and it's just the progress of how he goes through his life and then his all of his other lives, how they change. And when you wake up the second time, and after I think about when you're about 3 or 4 years old, you start to get your memories back from your previous lives. So you don't know who you are until you're about 3 or 4 years old. And like in the beginning, when you first this happens to you, um, you kind of go insane. It's pretty typical for people in their second and third lives to just go insane because they think they're crazy. But then you adapt, and going through Harry's lives, it's really cool to see what he did with his lives and to think about what you would do with your lives. Also, there's a end of world type dooming plot to where somebody else that's like him, that is in the same time period, is making changes that are having ripple effects across the world, across all timelines. And people communicate with this while, like, in the beginning of the book, I believe Harry's like 80 years old in the hospital, and a little girl comes who's also one of his type, who is lives in the future from him, and they pass down messages that way from the beginning of their lives to when they die. They go back in time to pass down a message to somebody at the beginning of their lives, and so on. I might not be describing this very well, but it is very interesting. And there is when somebody is inventing thing, he after he's going through a couple of his lives, he's noticing that, oh, this shouldn't have been invented for another 10 years. Why is this here now? And those ripple effects are actually having really, really bad impacts throughout the world. So it's cool to see how he finds this person that's doing this and what he does to solve to figure it out. Five, Never Die by Rob J. Hayes. I believe I mentioned this a whole bunch of times. This kind of a little of a caveat. There's a couple of books on here that I guess three of the books on here are part of a series or a duology or something, but they can be treated as standalone. So Never Die is part of a series that Rob J. Hayes is continually writing. The second one just came out, but they're all individual within their own. It's the same universe, same area, but they're all individual stories. So I don't, as of right now, I don't think you have to read them in any sort of order. You can just pick this one up or the other one up, and it's completely fine. Never Die. Legendary warriors are conscripted to join forces to help a little boy out with something he's got going on. And I can't really say too much after that, but they each have their own specialties, and it's a really fun read. Number four, Unkindness of Magicians. This one is really fun. It's short. It has to do with a secret magical society in New York. There are certain families and clans of magicians in New York. And I guess each year, each couple of years, there is a competition to see who has the strongest magician of that house, and whoever and a tournament happens, and whatever magician comes out on top, that house is now the leader of their magical society. And they repeat. And this is actually a magic system also that has a cause, or has a cost to it. So you use magic. The more you use, the more effect it takes onto your body, and the crappier you feel. You almost get like a hangover feeling, I think, if I remember correctly, and otherwise. And there's two different types of magic that people use. So it's really interesting. It's really cool. It's I would yeah, it's a really fun read because of the political twists and turns that happen throughout it as well. Number three, Priory of the Orange Tree. This one's so long it could pretty much be a trilogy. So it's I guess it's got that going for him. It's over 800 pages. So in any other book series, you could probably replace it with a trilogy almost, but it is long. It's got so much to it. So it has that fantasy length to dive into the characters and build the world and really go into. There's a little bit of magic to it. There's dragons. There's different types of societies that either worship dragons or outlaw them in a way. They curse dragons and such. And there's a lot of different moving pieces and a couple of different factions that are trying to seize power, and ancient forces, that whole rigmarole. but it is really good. The characters are pretty good as well. It's basically like a shortened fantasy series that you would want, but just in one book, one 800-page book. So it is really good if you want a comprehensive fantasy story, but only want to read one book. Number two. So the top two, I always go back and forth between being my favorite ones, and I read them in the same year, and I had the same argument with myself that year because I enjoyed both of them thoroughly. They're both fantastic and ones that I would possibly reread. I never reread any books, but these two would be possible up there for rereading. But I'm going to go with number two is going to be the more popular one, and the number one is the less known one. So that kind of gives it that bump. Number two, Ready Player One. It's one of my all-time favorites. It's kind of a book that you either love it or hate it. It seems either you really like all of the '80s references and bombing with that, and the just pretending like you could live in the Oasis and that type of world, or you completely hate all the references and think it's not creative and it's just complete shit. I love it. I love the puzzles of it. I would go back and read it for the puzzles because I'm sure I'd forget what they were. I also really like the movie. The movie's completely different from the book. The book is obviously still going to be better, and the puzzles are a little bit more elaborate, but it's still really, really good, both of them. So I really, really like the book, and it was one of the fastest reads that I ever had. And lastly, number one, this is probably going to be very less known compared to all the other ones, and that is going to be The Rook. So The Rook is really cool, really interesting. Think of like X-Men to where people get the powers. It's almost like mutants, but people get these powers, and there's a secret organization of like a government organization to the people that have these powers. So they are funded by the government, but it's completely secret and they're labeled as something else. And they take on and tackle any sort of supernatural occurrences that happen throughout the world. If there's like these beasts that are in the water or that pop up anywhere that can't be explained or dealt with by local authorities, then this agency comes in. And the I was hooked from page one because it's not only a world with all these people with different powers. It's not like, Mistborn to where you have these dozen abilities and that's the abilities, and then there's these types of abilities. This is like no holds bar. You can have the most random powers ever. It could just be, like in a Family Guy to where Meg can grow her fingernails and that's all she can do. There's kind of like people like that here to where they have super mundane, pointless abilities. And then there's other people with more ridiculous abilities. And there's even a vampire and people like that. But since page one, the first sentence, I was hooked. How the book opens up is the main character awakes in the middle of a park during the rain, surrounded by dead bodies. No memory, does not know at all who she is, but she has a letter on her written to her by herself. So herself knew that she was going to lose her memory, and she left her a letter describing things. And then throughout the book, she has all kinds of other letters written by herself, her former self, to tell her what's going on, kind of thing. And because she lost her memory, her personality completely changes as well. And there's a lot of funny moments. There's a mystery to it because she's trying to figure out who she is and why she lost her memory, and then all the other chaos and stuff that's going on in her world. And she is what's called a rook. So the organization that I mentioned, the secret organization, their hierarchy is tiered, and their ranking system is based off of like chess pieces. So there's rooks, there's bishops, there's queen, there's king in their organization. And she's a rook. So she's a very important part of this organization, but she has no memory of what she is or who she is. And doesn't even completely realize what her abilities are either. So you slowly are learning through her eyes, as so we're learning the same time as she is, which is really cool, and it keeps you engaged and going through it because you're wondering what her next letter is going to say, what she's going to find out next. And then once the plot gets woven into it, the mysteries to it, who's behind what. It's really, really good. I've recommended it to my wife. Absolutely loved it. Another friend absolutely loved it that I recommended it to. It'll go really fast. It's a 500-page book, so it's not too bad. This one also, as I mentioned before, this is a duology, so there is a sequel book. So if you really like this one, there's a sequel book called Stiletto. That one is not quite as good. It's still good. If you really love the Rook, I think you'll still find things to like about Stiletto because you're still a part of that world. It has two brand new POVs, so it's not the same one in Stiletto, but you can just read the Rook and be happy with it. It leaves off in a little bit of a cliffhanger, but it's not quite necessary to continue if you don't want to. So that's what I would really, really recommend, especially the Rook. So those are my 7 standalone fantasies, sci-fi fantasies that I have so far. I will be making an effort to branch out and add some more to this list because I'd really like to shake it up. And maybe by the time I do this again, I'll have a top 10. It'll be, half of these will be gone or something. Who knows? But this is a good eye-opening way to see what you have and haven't read by breaking it down to certain things like like just sci-fi fantasy standalones. So what are some of your standalones? What are some standalones that I should add in the sci-fi fantasy genres that could, potentially crack this list or make your list? Well, let me know in the comments and let's chat about this. And hopefully I can get into them and they'll pop up on my list next time. See you later.